Okay, today we're going to learn Eruvin Daf Kaf Aleph. Today's Daf is sponsored by Mary Lee, whose husband Stephen Lee studies with Hadron daily, who's happy to listen to the voices of women, especially studying Talmud, and it would likely drive her crazy being locked down together during this pandemic if you weren't so interested in it. Okay, we're going to start with the bottom of Kaf Amud Bet. Okay, today we're going to start with some halachic issues about Pasei Biraot, and kind of this is a stepping back all of a sudden and saying, we've talked about a lot of the details about Pasei Biraot and how this works and how this allowed people during the Aliyah LaRegel to get to the Beit HaMikdash and to drink. Now we're going to have all sorts of questions. Does this allow, is this for everybody to use? Is this only in Israel for Aliyah LaRegel? Does it apply in other places? We're going to ask a whole bunch of questions. And then we're going to get off on a big tangent again into Agadah and all sorts of statements about, mainly about the importance of Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah we're going to get to soon. Okay, so let's start with 3 lines from the bottom of Kaf Amud Bet. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Ada, lo hutru pasei biraot ela laole regalim bilvad. Pasei biraot were only permitted for those going on Aliyah LaRegel. Okay, so while we said that they instituted this for that purpose, you might have thought, well, then it allows them all the time. But now they say it's really only for those going on Aliyah LaRegel, meaning going to the temple 3 times a year for the holidays. V'hatanya, but doesn't it say in a Braita, lohutru pasei biraot ela legabe behema bilvad? They only allow this for animals, which sounds like it's allowed all the time for animals and also only for animals. We'll talk about this soon. So what do they answer? My behema, behemat ole regalim. When they say animals, they meant for the animals of the people who are going on Aliyah LaRegel. So now we have 2 limitations. Number 1, it's only if you're going to the temple for the holidays. And number 2, it's only for your animals and not for people. So now they're going to say, so what about Adam? Aval Adam mitapes ve'oleh mitapes ve'yored. Really, it should be the reverse order. Okay, it should be mitapes ve'yored, mitapes ve'oleh, meaning he climbs and goes down into the well, and he climbs and climbs up out of the well. Okay, so a man is allowed, or a person can actually climb into the well, whereas an animal can't do that. I thought it was interesting that in the news this morning, there was this thing that happened on Friday in Israel where a guy fell into a pit. I think it was very 20 meters deep or something, and actually died in Wadi Ara in Israel. And his brother went in and his brother fell in and managed to get out, but he didn't manage to get out. But it was interesting, this idea of someone falling into a pit. It actually happened. Unfortunately, one of them died. So anyway, this idea that a person could actually go down into this well and get the water himself, and therefore doesn't need to use the Pasei Biraot as a heter to take the pail, draw water from the well. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Ini, v'hamar of Yitzchak, actually the note says it should be, the Haggadah Bach says it should be Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef more often quoted Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. So Hamar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, lo hutru pasei biraot ela lebe'er mayim chayim bilvad. Another statement about this, what they're basically doing is they're taking different statements that were said about these pasei biraot that allow, right, these little posts one puts around the well to allow drawing water, and they're trying to fit them all together. They must work together. Now, sometimes we know that statements, Braitas don't always work together, and maybe there were different approaches about this, but the Gemara likes, if they can, to fit them all together. So they say, well, then why is it only be'er mayim chayim? Why is it only water that comes fresh water rather than rainwater, which is drinking water? We all know that there's some places you get to and they say, do not drink the waters here, it's not healthy. So also then there was water that was potable, and there's water that's not. So they said pasei biraot are only for drinkable water. Now this sounds strange because if it's for an animal could drink any kind of water. What's the difference? Why does it need to be potable? So they say, in order to allow, now it's an interesting thing, what they're saying is in order to allow the Pasei Biraot to work, the water has to have significance even for humans. Once it's significant for humans, it's significant enough that we can make this heter of the Pasei Biraot. But if it's not significant for humans, even though it's really designated for animals, therefore we don't allow it. And we'll see, because there are certain circumstances, which connects to this issue of the person who fell into the bore and died. There are certain circumstances where we're going to allow humans to drink this, and maybe because of that, they only wanted to allow it when it's potable water. even though mostly it's meant for animals. Now they say, "Aval adam metapes ve'olem metapes ve'yored." But then they add, the Braita continues and says, "V'imayu rechavim afilu l'adam nami." If it was so wide, the opening of the well, the idea is, how does a person get into the well? Person holds on to both sides and goes inside. But if you can't hold on to both sides, right, it's much harder to climb out by holding two hands on one side when the well is very wide. If the well is very narrow, then you can climb in and climb out because you can hold on to both sides. If you can't hold on to both sides because the well is so wide, then we actually allow the humans to drink from the well to basically pull it out and bring it into this area that we've now designated again to be Reshut HaYachid. What's interesting is we talked about the other day that how these mechitzot are perfect mechitzot, and they're right. It was all, well, if it doesn't work, then it shouldn't work. So therefore, we must view these as actual mechitzot. And now all of a sudden today we're seeing, well, they really don't want to allow them though in all circumstances, and only when you have no choice is it allowed for humans. And then the end of that Braita is this weird line that we had to explain against the pshat of the line, which again we're going to discuss today. Okay, but additionally, right, the Braita continues, you can't actually fill a bucket and put it in front of your animal. In other words, again, we're limiting. We allow you to draw the water out of the well with the bucket. Number one, for animals. Number two, if the person himself can't get down into the well and get out easily. But then it says you can't fill it up and put the pail in front of your animal. Right? What can you do? You can fill up something for the animal to then drink on its own. So now we're going to have a question on this. And from here, we're going to get again to the explanation we saw yesterday. And in fact, the Gemara is not going to go through all the details because it was long and complicated. They're just going to say, etc. Okay, and look back at yesterday's, it was yesterday's daf. Matkifla Rav Anan, by the way, there's no pictures today other than the pictures from yesterday, which we're going to talk about this weird case right now. Other than that, there's no pictures today. Matkifla Rav Anan imken mahu ilu pasei biraot. Well, if you can't allow the person to put the pail in front of the animal, then what have these pasei biraot done for us? Don't the pasei biraot create a reshut yachid, and then theoretically you should be able to put it in front of the animal? So they say, wait a minute, that's a silly question. It says, Ma'u ilu pasei biraot, ma'u ilu limalot mehen. What do you mean? The pasei biraot allow the person to draw the water out of the well using his pail. Then the person puts the pail in front of then he can't put the pail in front of the animals, but he pours it into something. Without pasei biraot, you can't even do that. So that's not a question. Ma'u ilu pasei biraot, the pasei biraot allows the owner of the animal to draw the water out of the well, bring it, and then put it into something else. So that can't be his question. His question must be, what did we talk about before? We said that you need rosha v'rubav, the animal, to be in this space. Now, if the person is pouring the water in front of the animal and the animal's in the space of the pasei biraot, then theoretically, there's no need for the rosha, the head and the majority of the animal, to be inside these boundaries. Because if the animal wants, right, you pour it in front of the animal walks out, we don't care, the animal will come back in and drink the water from within. The whole idea of rosha v'ruba was there's a concern that I might take the pail out. But if I'm not allowed to anyway carry the pail while I'm giving the animal water, then of course I'm not going to take the pail out. So then why do you need rosha v'ruba of the animal to be inside? The whole idea of rosha v'ruba was that then while you're giving the animal water, you won't end up taking the pail outside because the majority of the animal's inside and the animal's not going to move outside. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense. So now we're going to answer like we did yesterday. Amar Abaye, Hacha b'may askinan, be'evus ha'omed b'reshut harabim gavoa 10 v'rochav 4. Remember this case where the animal was in a reshut yachid in the barn. The animal, in this case that they're discussing, right? If the animal was inside the pasei biraot, you would need rosha v'rubo, and then you could actually hold the kli, the pail. But if this weird case where the animal was in a private domain and you're in the space in between the pasei biraot, but what happens here? There's something in between. There's an evus that's omei b'reshut harabim. There's something that's defined as a reshut yachid, which is the trough of the animal, which is standing in reshut harabim, but it itself has all the definitions of a private domain: 4 by 4 amot wide, 10 10 tefachim high. I'm sorry, 4 by 4 tefachim wide, and 10 by 10. No, right? It's 4 by 4. Sorry, arba'at tefachim. Right, 4 by 4 tefachim wide, 10 tefachim high. Right, this is all hand breadths, and then rosho nechnas lebein hapasim. Remember, what's the issue? That the edge of the trough, and I'm going to show you the picture. You can look back at yesterday's pictures. Okay, by the way, the WhatsApp group already got full. I put up a new link on the site. So if you join the WhatsApp group so you can get the pictures, so go back on the site and now that it's open again if it wasn't working for you. So here we have, no, it's not this picture. It's the picture here. Okay, picture 135. Okay, we have the animal. We have the trough, and the animal's drinking from the trough. The edge of the trough goes into the private space between the Pasei B'Ra'ot. Our whole concern is between where the Pasei B'Ra'ot start and the wall where the animal is, there's a small space of Reshut Yachid there. We're worried that if the person takes the pail from the well, brings it to the trough, now, theoretically, what he's supposed to do is, according to the Braita, he's supposed to pour it in, and that's it. If he's allowed to bring the pail to the animal, what are we worried? That while he goes to bring the pail, and the animal supposedly is supposed to walk out in the trough to the space that's in Reshut Yachid still, he might see that something's broken in the trough, and he'll go to fix it. And when he goes to fix it, he'll put down the pail, he'll keep the pail in his hand, he'll accidentally put it down in that space that's Reshut Rabin. If you remember, that in and of itself is not a problem, because when he picked up the pail, he didn't pick it up with the intent to put it down in the public domain. But after he puts down the pail to actually fix the trough, then he's going to pick it up and bring it back into the space he was in before, and that will be carrying from public to private, and that is forbidden. So therefore, don't worry, this doesn't mean, okay, remember, what did we start with? What's the point of having Rosho V'Rubo of the animal inside if you can't even put the pail in front of the animal anyway? And the answer is that this Braita wasn't talking about when the animal's in the walls of the Pasei B'Ra'ot. This is talking about some other case. If the animal is within the Pasei B'Ra'ot, these posts, and the be'er is right there, then you're allowed to take the pail and give it straight to the animal, as long as Rosho V'Rubo, the head and the majority of the body of the animal, is in this space. Okay, so that's what we learned now. Next. Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav. Okay, so now we get to an interesting halacha. You have to remember historically who is Rav. Rav is the person who comes from, he's one of the first Amoraim, and from the first generation. He moves from Israel to Babylonia, and he sets up the first big yeshiva in Babylonia. There was some learning going on before, but he really shifts the center to Babylonia. Now, this is very important background to this section. Ein borganin bevavel v'lo pasei b'ra'ot b'chutz la'aretz. There's no halacha of borganin. I'll get to that in 1 minute because we haven't learned that yet. And there's no pasei b'ra'ot in chutz la'aretz. What does this mean? What did we learn? Pasei b'ra'ot, what's the purpose of them? For aliyah la'regel, for going up to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple. Now, we're talking now post-temple time period, right? 70 is the destruction of the temple. Beginning of the Tkufat Amoraim is 200. Get the exact year that Rav moves to Bavel. Maybe it's 220. I'm not sure though, 221. I don't remember. Don't quote me on it. You can look it up. But Rav moves to Bavel around then. We're talking post-temple time period. There's no more Aliyah LaRegel, okay? What takes place of Aliyah LaRegel? Learning, okay? Basically, learning and prayer, right? Those are the two things that kind of take the place, but learning becomes very, very central, okay? So now what happens? He says, there's no law of Pasei B'Ra'ot and Chutz La'aretz, but notice he doesn't say Bavel. There's basically, in their world, there's 3 places. There's Bavel, Eretz Israel, or I would start with Eretz Israel. There's Israel, right, which has one status. There's Babylonia, which has another status. And then there's Chutz La'aretz, which is everywhere else. Okay, which everywhere else didn't really mean the whole world. It meant the other countries around where they were living. Because they weren't talking about global. Okay, that wasn't their view. So their worldview was much smaller, narrower. So what happens? He basically starts to say that not all the laws of Israel apply outside of Israel. So the laws of Pasei B'Ra'ot that are meant for Aliyah LaRegel are allowed in Israel. Now notice he says not allowed in Chutz La'aretz, but he doesn't say they're not allowed in Bavel. So it seems like he thinks they'd be allowed in Bavel, which we'll get to why soon. So that you can use this solution of putting, if people need a drink, you could do it in Bavel. Okay, but you can't do it in Chutz La'aretz. The law of Borganin is a different law. Borganin, thank you. I see Caroline put up about, it was 219, the year that Rav came to Babylonia. Thank you. I was close. So now he says that Borganim is a different halacha. This has to do with Eruv Tchumin. This we're going to get to in this 4th chapter, which is walking outside the city limits more than 2,000 amot. Now, you can't walk more than 2,000 amot outside the city limits unless you put up an Eruv. We discussed that already. We'll get back to that. But assuming you didn't put up an Eruv, there's another thing that allows you to go past the city limits more than 2,000 amot, and that's if there's huts. These huts were generally meant for people who watched outside the city, generally were fields. So there were watchmen for the fields, guards. So those guards lived in huts. Those huts, if you have a hut outside your city limits, that's within 70 and 2/3 amma, that's the number that they gave. Then, and let's say you had huts going every 70 and 2/3 amma, cubits, from the city till the next city, as long as you don't pass a space of 70 and 2/3 without a hut, you're allowed to carry. Okay, so not carry, you're allowed to travel from city to city. So these huts are basically ways to permit you to walk farther than the limits. But there's no laws of Borganim beBavel. We're going to see why in a second. So Borganim beBavel lo, dishchiche bidki. What does that mean? There's a lot of rainstorms, and that means that a hut that's not very well built is going to be destroyed. So you can't rely on them because they might be destroyed in Babylonia. Pasei biraot b'chutz la'aretz lo, de lo shchiche mitivta. Now we see that, as I mentioned before, the yeshivas replaced the temple, basically. Since there are no yeshivas outside of Babylonia, because again, right, Rav establishes big yeshivas in Babylonia, but there's no big yeshivas anywhere outside of Babylonia. Therefore, since they don't have big yeshivas, we don't allow the Pasei Biraot. It's to allow people either to get for the holidays to the temple, which no longer exists, and in the absence of that is to allow people to get to yeshivas. So that exists in Israel and that exists in Babylonia, but not anywhere else. Aval ipcha avdina, but the reverse would be okay, meaning you can have borganim in chutz la'aretz because there we're not so worried about these rainstorms, and in Babylonia you can have Pasei Biraot. That's the first version of what he says. But now we have an Ika D'Amra. We have a different version of this. Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amarav, Ein borganinu Pasei Biraot, lo beBavel v'lo b'chutz la'aretz. We don't have either of these work in Bavel and not in chutz la'aretz. Borganim beBavel lo d'shchiche bidki. Okay, so borganim in Babylonia we don't have, we already know because of the storms. B'chutz la'aretz nami lo d'shchiche ganve. There's a lot of thieves in other places. Again, this is always a way of being derogatory a little bit about not places that are Israel. So Israel, we don't have thieves. We all know that, right? Nobody robs anybody in Israel. There's no problem of theft at all, being a little sarcastic. But anyway, they claim that those huts in chutz la'aretz would often get robbed. Because people robbed them, they weren't really considered houses, because a house is something that's protected, and these weren't protected. So in chutz la'aretz, the borganim don't function either as borganim. Pasei Biraot beBavel lo d'shchiche maya. Now we're going to have a different reason why you can't use. Yes, there's yeshivas and people are going to yeshivas, but they don't need them because there's tons of water. This, by the way, is going to be a prelude to the sugya where they all talk about when we say v'tein talu matar levracha. When we ask for rain, it's going to be different in Babylonia and in Israel. And this explains why outside of Israel nowadays, it's not the same time period, and it's all based on Babylonia. Because in Babylonia, they didn't need rain like they did in Israel. So and the rainy season was much later, or when they needed rain was later. So basically, you see there was a whole difference in their need for rain. So now they say because there's so much water and there's streams all over, there's no need because the animals just go to the streams and they drink from there, and it's not a problem. You don't even need to draw water for them because there's water everywhere. And b'chutz la'aretz nami lo de lo shchiche mitivta. And in chutz la'aretz not because they don't have yeshivas. Okay. What's interesting about this is part of a bunch of sugyot in the Gemara where there's an attempt to put Babylonia in the same status as Israel. And this is because, as I said, when we understand this historically, this is Rav speaking, and Rav was trying to establish, right, we talked about this before, how Israel was then trying to have a hold on their centrality of their central authority. Like, for example, Kiddush HaChodesh, they said only we can determine when we do the new moon. And here is an attempt by the Babylonians to say, we have status of Israel. Just like they have Pasei Biraot, we have Pasei Biraot. And if we don't, it's not because we're any less significant, it's only because we don't need them. Okay, but in the first version, it was all Babylonia is like Israel. And where else do we see this? For example, in Gittin. There's certain things you have to say, b'fanai nechtav, b'fanai nechtam, if you're in Chutz La'aretz, because there's two possible reasons, Rabba and Rabba. I'm not going to get into the details, but according to some, they say, oh, well, it's because people don't really know the laws. But in Bavel, they know the laws. It's just like Israel, okay? Or they try to say, Bavel is like Israel for these purposes, okay? And it's an attempt to say, we have the same status as Israel does. So this is, again, part of that whole issue that you see in a number of places. Amarle Rav Chisda Mary Bered Rav Huna Bered Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba. Okay, notice who's here again. Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, who made this statement. We now have Rav Chisda talking to Mary, the son of Rav Huna, who was the son of Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba. So basically, Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba's grandson. So he says to him, Amre Atitu mi Barnash lebeit Knishta de Daniel. I see that you walk from the city of Barnash to the Beit Knesset of Daniel. Apparently Daniel from the Tanakh, there was a Beit Knesset in his name that was attributed to him somehow. There was this Beit Knesset of Daniel, which was Tlata Parse. It was 3 parsaot. 3 parsaot. 3 parsaot is about 4 meal. A meal is about 2,000 amma. So each meal is 2,000 amma. 4 meal is 8,000 amma. So you're walking 8,000 amma. That's 4 times the amount of tchum outside the city to get there on Shabbat. This, by the way, comes out to 11.5 to 14 kilometers approximately. There's always a debate about exactly these sizes, or 7.5 to 8 miles approximately. So he says, how are you doing this? Am I samich to a borganim? Are you holding by borganim? If you're holding by borganim, ha amar avua davua, your grandfather, right, the father of your father said, mishmei de Rav, in the name of Rav, aim borganim bebavel. So how could you be doing this? So So he showed him, I'm not relying on borganim. What am I relying on? If you look every 70 2/3 amma, there's some destroyed city, and there's still some walls left. And because there was a city that was destroyed, but the city was in existence, and there's still parts of the city left, even though no one's living there, I rely on that. And that's what's allowing me to do this. It has nothing to do with borganim, and those aren't going to be destroyed by the rains. Look, they're still standing, and therefore that's what I rely on. Amar Rav Chisda. Now that we have Rav Chisda here, and he was trying to marry Bered Rav Huna, now we're going to have 2 drashot that Rav Chisda says in the name of Mary Barmar. They seem disconnected to what we're learning, but we'll try again to connect them back to what we're doing. And I even want to suggest connecting them back to what Rav Yirmiyah Bar Elazar said, all those 7 statements of his on the previous pages. Amar Rav Chisda, Derish Mary Barmar, my dichtiv lechol tichle ra'iti ketz v'chava mitzvatcha me'od. We're now quoting a verse in Tehillim, in Psalms, which says everything has an end, everything can be measured, but the mitzvot are so wide that you can't even measure them. Davar zeh amro David. So David said this because he wrote, right? Tehillim is attributed to David HaMelech. V'lo pirsho, but he didn't explain how wide are the mitzvot. He didn't give it an amount. Amaro Iyov. Iyov said the same kind of idea. V'lo pirsho, and also didn't describe. He didn't say how big is it. Amro Yechezkel. Yechezkel also said this. V'lo pirsho, and didn't explain. Ad Sheba Zechariah ben Iddo, until Zechariah, who's actually the grandson of Iddo, not the son, but anyway, Zechariah, the Navi Zechariah in Treasav, in the 12 books, Upirsho, he finally explained it to everybody. So now the Gemara is going to explain what are all these things that they all said, and where's the actual explanation, and what's the amount. How big is, what they're basically trying to say is, how big and vast is the Torah? Amro David v'lo Pirshu, dechtiv l'chol tichle ra'iti ketz rechava mitzvatcha me'od. That's the verse we just quoted. Amaro Iyov v'lo Pirsho. Iyov said it and didn't explain. Dechtiv, alucha me'eretz midah. The land is too great for measurement. Urechava mini yam. Sorry, I said it wrong. The Torah is aruka me'eretz. It's greater than the land. Midah, in other words, by any measurement. Urechava mini yam, and it's much wider than the sea. But notice he didn't give an end point. He just said it's greater. Amro Yechezkel v'lo Pirsho dechtiv vayifros ota lefanai v'hi ktuva panim v'achor. Okay, the Torah was spread before him, and it was written on both sides. V'katuv elah, and it was written on this. There was this Megillah, and it was written on it kinim v'hege v'hi. It was written Lamentations and song and a melody and woe. Okay, so kinim, what was written on this? Kinim zopor anatan shel tzadikim ba'olam hazeh. This is all what was written, what the kinim, the lamentations, are all the lamentations for the tzaddikim, the righteous people that get punished in this world. V'cheinu omer kinai v'konenuha. Okay, this is a kinah, and they will sing it. What's the melody? This is what the tzaddikim are, their reward in the world to come. The kahada amar, and as it says, alehi gayon b'chinor, which means I'm going to, it's the song that is accompanied with the kinor, with the lyre. Vehi zoi pranutan shel rashaim latid lavo. The vehi, the woe, is what's going to come to the bad people in the world to come. All the punishments they're going to get. V'cheinu omer hoveh al hoveh tavo, which means, right, calamity upon calamity is going to come. So all this is basically talking about the vastness of the Torah without giving it any boundaries. What are the boundaries? How large is actually the Torah or the mitzvot? It's kind of a general. Now he doesn't exactly define it, but we're going to figure out a mathematical calculation of how we can get to how large it is, how vast. So he says to Zechariah has a vision, and God says to him, what do you see? And I'll say, I said, I see a flying scroll. It's 20 by 10 cubits. Now, the assumption here is that we're talking about in God-sized cubits, okay? Now, if it's a Megillah Afa, some people say Afa comes from a different word, which means folded. So it must have been folded. So if it was folded, open it up. If it was 20 by 10 and we open it up, we get to 20 by 20. Okay, take something 20 by 10, open it up, you get to 20 by 20. Then he says, so when you open it up, it's 20 by 20. And it says, panim va'achor. By the way, this sounds like the achor, vakedem, tzartani, the man that was panim va'achor, right? He had two sides when he was created. Male and female. So here also there's panim va'achor. Now, if it had both sides, so imagine you slice it in the middle and have the both sides kind of separated, you'll have a space, or even if you don't, but imagine it, right? You basically measure 20 by 20 on one side, 20 by 20 on the other, you get to 40 by 20. 40 by 20 is 800 square cubits of area. So now they say, uchtiv, Mi madar b'shalom mayim b'shamayim b'zeret tiken. Okay, this is a verse in where's this verse from? Right, this is from Yeshayahu, Perek Mem. Okay, which basically means that who can measure, right? God can measure with his hand the water and the heavens b'zeret tiken. Okay, zeret is your pinky, but zeret means the span from his thumb to his pinky, which is known to be a half a cubit. Okay, which means that the heavens, which basically is a sign for the heavens and the earth, is the size of a square cubit. Now, what's a square cubit? And as of the span, the area of the span. What's the area? Half by half, right? We do 1/2. If it's 1/2 cubits of length, so the area is going to be a half by a half, which is a quarter of a cubit. So now let's do the math. If the Torah itself is 800 cubits, and the world is a quarter of a cubit, then what do we get? The entire world is 1 and 3,200 of the Torah. So think about that's now we finally get the amount, if that amount means anything to you, right? That it's 3,200 times the size of the entire world, the earth. Okay, there we finally got our calculation of how vast the Torah is. Mary Barmar. What did Mary Barmar say? My dichtiv, another drasha of his. Dudaim generally mean mandrakes. It's a type of plant. If you remember from Leah with the dudaim, she used them for fertility. But here they're going to explain that dudaim means baskets. There's 2 baskets of te'inim. Okay, this is a nevuah of Yirmiyahu. He sees a vision, and in his vision there's 2 baskets of figs. Muadim lifnei Hechal Hashem, they're ready before the entrance to the Hechal. Hadud echad te'inim tovot ma'od. Okay, the Hechal is the sanctuary of God. So they're standing before the sanctuary of God. One has good te'inim ma'od, ki te'inei habakurot. Okay, like the ones that ripen very quickly. Those are the good ones. Remember we talked about figs, there were bad figs and good figs, so here also. This is why I think the sugya clearly connects back to the one about, we talked about the diufra, which was the figs that are grown 2 times a year that are still good. And And in the other one are bad figs. So there's a basket of good figs and a basket of bad figs. Asher lo te'achelna meroa. Right, the bad ones can't be eaten because they're so bad. Teinima tovot. So what's this an image of? What's this a metaphor for? Tovot elu tzadikim gemurim. These are the righteous people, purely righteous. Teinima ha'ot elu rishaim gemurim. These are the total evil people, right? Gemurim means in their entirety. V'shema tomar avad sivram ubatel sikuyam. This is great for Elul, right? You might say, right, the month of repentance, you might say, oh, they've lost hope and they have no hope anymore for the future. They have no chances anymore. Talmud lomar, now because they're talking about dudaim here, and the dudaim here reference in Yirmiyahu reference good and bad figs, they now say, look at Shir HaShirim. In Shir HaShirim, there's also a reference to the dudaim, and it says there, hadudaim natnu reach. The dudaim gave a beautiful smell. Now notice it says dudaim in plural, which refers to, they're now connecting this to the verse in Yirmiyahu. There were two types. Here, both types are giving reach. What does that mean? This is like we saw the other day. Elu ve'elu atidim sheyitnu reach. Both of them in the future will give a beautiful smell. Okay, meaning the Rishaim will come back. This goes exactly with that sugya we saw before about the evil people returning to God, right? When they get to Gehenom, Avram will bring them and they'll get back to God. Darish Rava. Rava explained this pasuk of dudaim natnu reach in a different way. He understood that dudaim are not these baskets that were referred to in Yirmiyahu. He understands dudaim in their typical sense. Is this the mandrakes? My dichtiva dudaim natnu reach, elu bachurei Yisrael shelo ta'amu ta'am chet. He says this is a reference to the young lads who never tasted a ta'am of sin. Okay, basically we're going to talk about licentious behavior. They didn't engage in that at all. This is the continuation of the pasuk. I'll read you the whole verse. So they brought out a beautiful smell. And on the entranceways, there were all these beautiful megadim are usually, I'm trying to think of the word, delicious, I can't think of the word, but treats, I think you would maybe say it. Chadashim gam yeshanim, old and new, or new and old. Dodit safanti lach, I've saved these for my beloved. Okay, so now, what is this all a reference to? So the dudaim are the bachurei Yisrael shelo natnu ta'am chet. Okay, delicacies, thank you. The next thing is p'tachenu kol magadim, all the delicacies are at our entranceways. They tell their husbands when they're available, meaning when they're not in nida. Okay, it's interesting. They're actually saying, these women are communicative with their husbands. It's a positive thing. Lishna achrina, some people say she'ogdot pitrehen lebalehem. They seal their entranceways for their husbands, meaning they don't allow anybody else in. Chadashim gam yeshanim dodit safanti lach. I've saved my special that I've saved for you, my beloved, are the old and the new, or the new and the old. Amra knesset Yisrael lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono shel Olam. Harbe gzerot gazarti al atzmi yoter mima shegazarta alai v'kiyamtim. You made all these ordinances for us, and we added even more. So the chadashim gam yeshanim, right? We added new things to your old Torah to make it even more protected. This is again a reference to the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So Amalei Rav Chisda la'umei Rabbanan to have a kamasader agadata kameh. So Rav Chisda was with this other rabbi who was bringing up this agadata in front of him. He says, he brought in general agadatot. So he says to the Baal agadata, he says, Mishmi alachai chadashim gam yeshanim mau. Do you know what this is, this chadashim gam yeshanim? So he says, Amalei elu mitzvot kalot ve'elu mitzvot chamorot. There were first stringencies, and then they added all these, or hard mitzvot, and then they added easier mitzvot. So Rav Chisda says, Amalei, v'chi Torah pamim, it's not what do you mean? The Torah was given twice. First we got hard mitzvot, then we got easy mitzvot. What are you talking about? Ella, he says, halalu midivrei Torah v'halalu midivrei sofrim. What he means is, and again, we get back to this idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, there's the written Torah, and then there's the oral Torah. Okay, there's these two things. The old, as we said before, is the written Torah, and then on that came the oral Torah. Darish Rava. Okay, continuing along this theme. Okay, I just want to remind you how we got here because it's a little bit disjointed. We started with Rav Chisda. Because we mentioned Rav Chisda earlier, now we bring these two drashot that Rav Chisda said. The first was about the measurement of the Torah, that it's boundless, but yet at some point somebody kind of gave us a little bit of a boundary, how wide it is. And then we had, which by the way, these are all going to kind of connect together. Then we had this idea of the dudaim, and that even the evil people will return back to God. But Rava took that pasuk and he darshaned it to teach us about the Torah Bal Peh, and how the oral Torah that was passed down by the rabbis is the extra that we added onto the Torah. And because we added all these boundaries, we were able to keep the mitzvot. Okay, so now we're going to continue along these lines. Darish Rava, he also darshan the following verse. My diktiv, v'yoter mehena b'ni hizaher asot sfarim harbe. Okay, this is at the end of Sefer Kohelet. His last words, Kohelet's advice to people is, listen, more than anything, hizaher asot sfarim harbe. You should make a lot of books. Ain kates, without any, this is the same idea before. There's no end to them. V'lahag harbe yigiat basar. Not so clear what that means. We're going to darshan that soon. So here he explains, what does it mean, make sfarim harbe? It means, you should be more careful with what the rabbis instituted than with what says actually in the written Torah. Divrei Torah, we've talked about this before, that sometimes they say, oh, Torah is obviously more important than Divrei Sofrim. But here we're going to say, no. You have to be more cautious with what the rabbis said than with the actual Torah itself. Why is that? An interesting thing to say. Divrei Torah yesh ben aseh v'lo taseh. Even though sometimes you get capital punishment for certain things, but there's many things in the Torah that you only get lashes for them if it's a lo taseh, or if it's an aseh, a positive commandment, and you just don't do it, you don't even get punished. But divrei sofrim, kol over divrei sofrim chayav mita. And this comes from this means anyone who goes against the rabbis gets the death penalty. Where does this come from? Ha poretz gader yeshachenu nachash. Okay, they say you're going to get bitten by a snake if you knock down fences. The rabbis put up fences to the Torah. If you knock those down, you're going to get bitten by a snake and die. They say, look, and then it sounds like anything the rabbis say you don't hold by, you're going to get bitten by a snake, you're going to get the death penalty. Shema tomar, im yesh ben mamash. Now, you might come and say, we're going to continue with the verse now. You might come and say, im yesh ben mamash b'pnei ma lo nichtavu. If they're so important, then why didn't they write them down, right? If are written Torah, and people give it a lot of significance because it's written. So why didn't they write down the oral Torah? And this goes back to all these issues of in those days, the oral Torah wasn't written at all. Amar Kra, that's why it says in that the continuation of that pasuk, Asot Sfarim Harbe Ein Kates. There would be no end to it. We can't possibly write down all of Torah Shabbat Peh. It would never be able to be contained in books. It's a great line. Belag Harbe Yigiat Basar. What's this? We're going to darshan this pasuk. I would say it kind of says the same thing, but one in a negative formulation and one in a positive formulation. Amar Papa Bred Rav Achabar Adam Mishmei Rav Achabar Ula Milamed Shekol Mal'id Al Divrei Chachamim. They say lahag, and they switch the hay with an ayin to laag. Laag is to mock. Anyone who mocks the Divrei Chachamim, nidon, this very unpleasant image, but so'aro tachat. I don't know exactly what it means, but boiling excrement. Okay, you're going to be, which basically means yigiyat basar. It's going to cause pain to your body. Okay, right? If you have boiling excrement, it would be very painful. So they're basically saying this is the negative formulation. Beware, you're going to get punished by boiling excrement. Matkifla rava miktiv laag. It doesn't say laag, it says lahag ktiv. So what is lahag? It comes from the root of hogeh. Hogeh is to meditate on. Kol hogeh bahen to'em ta'am basar. Yigiyat basar, we've used in the positive. It's going to be like tasting meat, how tasting meat is a delicious thing. Learning Torah and meditating on it, that brings the pleasure of eating meat. It's like the pleasure of eating meat. It's such a pleasurable activity. This is the marketing for learning, right? Learn Torah learn Torah Shabbat Peh specifically because it gives you so much reward, right? And physical reward. You almost feel the reward. Tanu Rabbanan, it sounds like our dedication for today, right? That the learning is what's keeping him going. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. We're now going to have a story about how important it is to keep what the rabbi said. Learn about Rabbi Akiva. He was in jail. Rabbi Yeshua Hagarsi Misharto b'chol yom vayom. Misharto. Rabbi Yeshua Hagarsi would be serving him. B'chol yom vayom hayom machnisim lo mayim b'midah. He would bring him water every day to drink. So every day he brought him water, a certain measurement of water. Yom the jail warden saw him one day. Amarlo, it looks like you're bringing more water than normal. You're trying to pour, right? What happens if you pour water in dirt? You can basically dig much more easily. Are you trying to have Rabbi Akiva dig himself out and escape from jail? So he spilled out half the water and left him with only half, which was less than what he normally got. Kishabayitz Rabbi Akiva, when he got to Rabbi Akiva, Amar lo, Yoshua, don't you know I'm old? That I'm dependent on you bringing me water? How could you bring me such little water? So we told him what happened. Amarlo, tenli mayim shetol yadais. He says, fine, just give me water so I can wash my hands. Amarlo, lishtot emigiim litol yadecha migiim. Wait a minute. Yoshua says to him, what? You're going to use your hands when you don't even have enough water to drink? Amarlo, ma'aseh shechayavin alehem mita. If I don't wash my hands, which is a Rabbanit in ordinance, then I'm going to get the death penalty, like that we said before about Hasporetz Gader Shachanu Nachash. Netilat Yadayim was a Geder for Tahara, for the impurity laws. And therefore, he says, Mutava mut mitat atzmi, I'd rather die on my own death for not eating, below ever al dat chaverai, and I shouldn't go against what my friends say. Amru lo ta'am, so they said about him, lo ta'am klum ad shevi lo mayim v'natal yadav. So he waited until he had enough water to wash his hands. What was the rabbi's response to this? If he was old and he did this, could you imagine when he was young and had more energy, how much more he must have kept to the rabbi's word? And when he's in jail, he did this. All the more so if he wasn't in jail, what he would be doing. Here you see how far he went to keep the words of the rabbis. Again, pikuach nefesh, you could say all sorts of things. This is a story. It probably didn't exactly happen like this. But again, the rabbis are bringing all these stories to strengthen Torah Shabbat Peh. We'll talk about this a little bit more soon. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. B'sha'ashen tiken Shlomo Eruvin u'netilat yadayim. Okay, Shlomo was mitaken Eruvin. Eruv, all laws we're learning. Netilat yadayim, like we just said, washing hands before eating bread. And also he was mitaken shniot la'arayot, which is all the derabbanans of arayot, of in who you are not allowed to sleep with. Which was, again, these were all gederot, Eruvin, a geder for Shabbat, Netilat Yadayim for purity and impurity laws, and Arayot for the Arayot in the Torah. Now, here it only mentions Eruvin and Netilat Yadayim. Tosfos says he must have done Arayot after this. But anyway, when he did those first two, Yatztabak Chova Amra, and now it's funny is they're quoting verses that Shlomo himself said in Mishlei, that he wrote, because it's attributed to Shlomo, and they're saying that the bat called the heavenly voice came down and said this to Shlomo. If you're so smart, wow, I'm so rejoicing with you because you're so smart that you did this. Another verse in Mishlei that you're so smart and I'm so happy with this because now those who go against me, I'll have something to give them to support me. Okay, and basically this is, again, those who go against the rabbis will have this to support them. Darish Rava, my dichtiv. So now Rava does another drasha. L'chadodi, again from Shir Hashirim. L'chadodi netzeh asadeh. Come, my beloved, let's go to the fields. Nalina bakfarim, we'll sleep in the villages. Nashkim ala kramim, we'll wake up early and go to the vineyards. Nir'em pracha gefen, we'll see if it started budding. Patachas madar, that's the first fruit that starts coming out. Heinatzu arimonim, if the full fruits come in bloom. Here we're talking about pomegranates now. Sham etenet odilach. Okay, this is where I will give my love to you. So what is this? What does it mean? Netzeh asadeh. Let's go out to the fields, not to the cities. The cities is where everybody's doing sins. They're stealing, they're engaging in licentious behavior, they're swearing falsely, swearing for no reason. Let's go to the fields. What's in the fields? There you have the rabbi, the students who are learning Torah and working in the fields. And even though they're busy working in the fields, they still make time for learning Torah. Nalina bakfarim. So now compare these people to the kfarim. Now what's the kfarim? Al tikvei bakfarim ela bekofrim. Those heretics. Okay, either this means Jewish heretics or maybe it means non-Jews bichlal in general. You did all this good to them. They don't believe in you. Nashkim ala kramim. Now, what are all these things images for? Kramim. The vineyards are elu batei knesiot ubatei midrashot. This is the shuls and the learning places. Nir'em parcha. So let's go there. Let's see who's there. Nir'em parcha gefen. These are ba'alei mikra because the beginning stages are learning Torah, the written Torah. Patachas madar elu ba'alei mishnah. Then let's see if there's people learning Mishnah. That's more developing. Heinetzu arimonim. That's the ideal. Elu ba'alei gemara. What does that mean? I'll show you all the praise, all my wonderful children and all the things they're doing. Some people say this relates back to the earlier people, the Bachurei Yisrael and the Banot, that were basically keeping the laws of family purity, or however you would call it. Amar Rav Hamnuna, my dichtiv, last thing for today, v'yidaber 3,000 mashal v'yishiro 5,000. Okay, so it's said about Shlomo that he spoke 3,000. This is a description in Sefer, the Book of Kings, Melachim, that he spoke 3,000 mishalim, parables, and his shiur was, his song was 1,005. Melamed shamar Shlomo al kol davar v'davar shel Torah 3,000 mashal. On everything he learned in the Torah, he had 3,000 parables for. Al kol davar v'davar shel sofrim, and everything of the rabbis 5,000 ta'amim. He had 1,005 explanations, reasons for everything. This sounds like Rabbi Meir, who gave reasons for everything. Right? We talked about that before, or there were different rabbis there on that page that gave reasons for everything. Rav Amar, my dichtiv yoter kohelet chacham od limei da'at ta'am v'izem v'chiker tekem mishalim harbe. This is at the end of Kohelet also. What does it mean? Limei da'at ta'am ta'ag marei b'simanei ta'amim. He taught them the tamei amikra, all the songs that, right, when you read the Torah, there's all the ta'amim that tell you where to stop and all that. And then how did he explain things? He brought analogies. This is a sign of a good teacher, brings analogies to what they're learning. And now it's funny because Ula is going to bring an analogy to what Shlomo's pasuk means. At first the Torah was like a basket with no handles. So without handles, it's very hard to hold the basket. Until Shlomo came and made handles. In other words, again, this goes back to the Netilat Yadayim and the Eruv and the Shniyot Arayot. He made handles to allow people to keep the Torah. So now I want to just say one thing, and this I want to thank Erica Schwartz, who wrote me right before Shabbat. She was listening to the shiur on the Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar, and she mentioned that a way to connect all the statements of his, and I think they're really connected to today's stuff also, is that it's talking all his statements. We're talking about duality. We started with the diomed, two parts that become one. We talked about man and wife, who two parts become one, right? It's all two of the same part, two sides of the same thing. The te'enim, the two that are, right, all come from one. And a lot of his statements talk about that there's part of the Shevach HaAdam, there's all of the Shevach HaAdam. And here in today's daf, it's comparing the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and the Risha'im Gemulim and the Tzadikim Gemulim. And in the end, even the Risha'im are going to be like the Tzadikim, right? They're going to repent. And the Torah Sheba'al Peh that you might think is not as important is just as important as the Torah Shebechtav, and you need all of it to work together. And it's this idea of duality in the world. So I think this connects back with that. And again, why are they making such a big deal about Torah Sheba'al Peh? It's obvious. And this, I think, even goes back to the Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chaim, where that whole sugya about the importance of the rabbis and the interpretations, because our entire Masechet is based on a concept that doesn't appear in the Torah at all, right? This is all, Eruvin is all Rabbanan, and they want to strengthen the rabbis and what they're saying. And for people to take Eruvin seriously, you have to understand the system and how it works and how important Torah Sheba'al Peh is. And that's why they have a whole, I would say, promo for how important Torah Sheba'al Peh is, in order that we understand how significant Eruvin is, because it really is protecting. It's almost like we have Masechet Shabbat, and now we have Masechet Eruvin, which is protecting Masechet Shabbat that we just learned, right? It's kind of our protection. In order to keep Shabbat, we need to put up Eruvin in order to protect. What's also interesting about this idea of duality, Eruvin is also bringing together different people, right? We have different people living in different things, and the Eruv combines them. It's this idea of this separate things that can be combined to be together. And that's the idea of this Torah Sheba'al Peh and Torah Shebechtav that work hand in hand together. Okay, with that, we'll end for today. Shavua Tov, everybody.